Hello, my name is Lorenzo, and today I'll be presenting our work investigating web service account remediation advice. You're probably wondering what account remediation is. This is a systematic process one performs to resecure their compromised account. In our research, we defined this process to have 5 phases. The first phase is to discover the compromise through noticing suspicious account activity. The second phase is to recover access to the account if it was lost or compromised. Following that, you then limit access to the account to prevent unauthorized access. The fourth phase is to restore the service of the account to its pre-compromised state. And finally, the last phase is to bolster the security of the account in order to prevent future compromises. Web services provide users with advice for account remediation in the form of help pages. However, account remediation is a technically complex process. Our work has found that advice for account remediation differs drastically among web services in terms of completeness. Incomplete account remediation advice does not fully help resecure a compromised account. Therefore, investigating the quality of advice for account remediation is critically important and serves as our main research objective. Our methods first start with developing a codebook for account remediation. This codebook is modeled after our account remediation definition and holds 5 categories. Once we developed our codebook, we then collected actual advice for account remediation from 57 total web services. These web services were all US-based and allowed for account creation. Following that, we then coded all the advice for account remediation from web services with our codebook, as we will demonstrate on the next slide. Looking to the left, you will see the categories in our codebook. They are compromise discovery, account recovery, limiting access, service restoration, and prevention. These categories reflect the phases for account remediation. Here's a snippet of advice for account remediation from Instagram. Looking at these first 3 lines, they are advising the user to notice any suspicious activity from the account. These lines will be coded under the compromise discovery category. Looking at this first line with blue text, it is advising the user to change your password or send yourself a password reset email to help resecure your account. This advice will be coded under the account recovery category. This last line of text advises the user to revoke access of the account from any suspicious third-party applications. This advice will be coded under the limiting access category. We present our results with the following analyses. First, we look at the overall coverage of phases for account remediation among all the web services in our study. Then we look to see if there are differences in the coverage of phases for account remediation among different groups of web services. We first look to see if there's differences in the coverage of account remediation phases in the advice between very popular web services and less popular web services. We also see if there's a difference in the coverage of account remediation phases in the advice between web services that have publicly disclosed a data breach and web services that have not publicly disclosed a data breach. Looking at the overall coverage, we first see that limiting account access is the only phase covered in less than 50% of web services. Service restoration was the next lowest phase, covered in approximately 74% of web services. The remaining 3 phases were covered in at least 90% of web services advice. Continuing the overall coverage, we find that only 39% of web services covered all 5 phases for account remediation in their advice. 74% of web services covered at least 4 phases of account remediation in their advice, and then 90% of web services covered at least 3 phases or categories of account remediation in their advice. Lastly, we look to see at the differences in the advice coverage among different groups of web services. We first see that very popular web services covered approximately 19% more of phases for account remediation in their advice as compared to less popular web services. We also find that web services that have publicly disclosed a data breach covered approximately 18% more phases of account remediation in their advice as compared to web services that have not publicly disclosed a data breach. Our takeaways for this research conclude that account remediation is a 5-phase process. However, less than 50% of web services covered advice for limiting account access. We also see that only 39% of web services mention advice for all 5 phases of account remediation in their advice. We also see that different groups of web services present different coverages of the phases for account remediation in their advice. This concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions.